I'm Ann Dickey. I am the president currently of the Mountain View Neighborhood Association. Thank you, Laura Hartman, for the Roanoke College Zoom account that gives us the upgrade. And Mrs. Holly is our neighbor and secretary of the Mountain View Neighborhood Association and lives on Patterson Avenue. She's been teaching the history of art and architecture in universities from North Dakota to North Carolina since 2004. Since moving to Roanoke in 2016, she's been researching the history of Mountain View with a particular interest in the architecture and people who lived in the houses of Patterson Avenue in the 1920s, what she calls the second generation of inhabitants. She hopes this work will eventually become available on a website called Historic Patterson Avenue, which is in the early stages of development. So Holly we're so grateful that she's going to share her passion project with us this evening and give us a preview of a walking tour that we sort of had to reschedule because of a leg injury that she sustained last fall. So when the weather gets good and there's no chance of ice, we will head out to see Patterson and Chapman Avenues. Tonight is focused on Chapman Avenue. Chapman and Patterson by foot. And we have some Chapman Avenue representatives here as well. All right, so I'm going to mute myself and take it away.
Okay. Am I unmuted? I am unmuted. Thanks, Anne, for asking me to do this because it's great to share this information, hopefully with people who are passionate about these houses like I am, but also it kind of put a fire under me to do some more research on this because it does get tedious. It seems sometimes like there's never going to be an end to it. So what I'm going to do tonight is present this in three different sections. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of history about the development of Roanoke, which leads to the development of the West End, Patterson Avenue, who was responsible for that. Then we're going to have a quick and dirty architecture lesson because I'm focusing on three different types of houses here on Patterson Avenue. And then we'll take the tour. And the tour will highlight specific houses and the people who lived in them, but also research problems that you come across when you're looking at the history of an older house. And the big lesson to take away from that, I think, is never trust Zillow and don't necessarily trust the deed cards from the GIS records that you can get online. And I'll give you some examples of why you shouldn't trust them. So let me share my screen with you and get started here. Okay. So I call this the second generation because the first generation of inhabitants on Patterson Avenue were relatively short-lived, and they were kind of a homogeneous group of people, and they were in very similar socioeconomic situations. And the second generation of inhabitants are, for the time, quite varied, and especially for Roanoke. So we will revisit each of these pictures on this slide in just a little bit, but let's jump in and look at the history part of this lecture and talk about the development of Roanoke. So nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Appalachia, the town of Big Lick was built on industry, especially the Norfolk Western Railroad, which was headquartered here from 1881 to 1982. In 1884, Big Lick became Roanoke. And between 1884 and 1890, the population grew from 5,000 to over 16,000. Old Southwest, which was the most developed residential area, was crowded and dirty, and more housing was needed. Development of the so-called West End met that need. So you could say that the West End was the first suburb of Roanoke. Now, the development of the West End was envisioned by this man in the middle. His name was Ferdinand Rohr, and this man had his hand in everything. Biographies by his contemporaries depict him with glowing praise, but there was a kind of unsavory side to Rohr as well. He was a little shady in his dealings. He was mostly a self-made man, but he was also extremely lucky in his endeavors. Originally, he was a farmer, both here in Roanoke County and in Pulaski County, where he enslaved over 100 people. After the Civil War, without enslaved people to do the labor, he decided that the hard work of farming just wasn't for him. So he turned to development and mining and came to Roanoke City, which was Big Lick at the time. He owned well over 500 acres in Roanoke City, including all of the West End. He opened an iron mine on Mill Mountain with its own narrow gauge railroad and ran a hugely successful hotel in Old Southwest. So those of you who aren't from Roanoke, we have a mountain in town just outside of downtown. That's Mill Mountain. So this iron mine wasn't way out in the boonies somewhere. It was literally in town. And what you're looking at here in these pictures, in the upper left, that is the Rohr Hotel, which is where the Y is now downtown. That's Mr. Rohr in the middle. On the lower right, that is one of his narrow gauge railways that's had an accident that would go up the mountain and collect ore and then take it back to where it needed to go. If you were a guest in his hotel and he liked you enough, he would give you a ride in his little train up the mountain to tour the mines, and then you'd go back to the hotel and have dinner. Now, the newspaper clipping, the article in the middle right here, is talking about how the output of ore was so great that Rohr actually had to buy 12 new cars and a brand new engine to handle all of this increased output in the mines. So the mines were super successful for Rohr. He was on the first city council when the city was still Big Lick, and he built the first theater downtown at Campbell and Third, which is what you see in the lower left-hand corner. And this also doubled as City Hall sometimes when it was needed. Despite all of his successes, though, he was constantly in legal trouble for his debts. And my favorite story about his debts includes a really complicated court case in which he offered a bunch of land as payment for a debt, but it turns out it was actually his wife's land, who was wealthy on her own, and she never gave it to him to use. And even his own children were involved in this lawsuit, and they piled on him to keep him from giving away basically their inheritance. He skipped out of town in the late 1890s and died bankrupt in Arkansas in 1906, having fled his creditors in Roanoke. He and most of his family are buried downtown in the Old City Cemetery, which, if you haven't ever been there, it's a really beautiful cemetery. There are a lot of old families there, and it's definitely worth trying to find parking and going to have a look. So that is where the idea to develop all of this land west of downtown came from. The West End contains the neighborhoods of Hurt Park and Mountain View, and Rohr owned all of the land west of downtown, and that's basically everything that is enclosed in this green circle. So basically, if you're coming down Campbell, where Campbell splits off into Patterson and Campbell, all of that all the way to the end to 24th Street and the industrial section is what Rohr owned. So during the 1882 railroad and industrial boom, when the city was still Big Lick, Rohr divided all this property into 2,500 lots on a grid system, naming many of the streets after his friends and family. He put them up for sale, and a group of bankers and industrialists saw a chance to make a lot of money, and they formed the West End Land Company, which was the largest real estate firm in the area at the time. They bought 15 blocks of Rohrer's grid. And by 1890, brand new large houses in the Victorian style were being built. Now, most of these early houses were east of 13th Street, so those no longer exist. A lot of 13th is just empty lots now and mid-century or more modern buildings. But there were a few early homes built west of 13th Street. Now, the crowning jewel of the West End was Patterson Avenue, and then it was called Patterson Avenue Parkway, or simply the Boulevard. It is named after Patterson Hannah Rohrer, which I know disappoints people who think it's named after their family, Patterson. Everybody argues about that, but Patterson Hannah Rohrer was one of Ferdinand's older sons and one of his business partners. This street was supposed to house some of the wealthiest and most chic members of Roanoke society. West of 13th, the brick paved street widened to almost 100 feet, which accommodated the 1890 double track streetcar extension in the middle, with wide lanes on either side for horse and carriage and later for cars. And if you look at the three pictures on the left, you can see there are Black workers excavating the street to lay the tracks. Then in the middle picture, the tracks are laid. And then in the final picture on the bottom, that street is bricked up. It's nice and smooth. This must be east of 13th Street, because most of Patterson west of 13th Street, the north side of the street, which is the left side if you're looking at the screen, is higher than the right side. And nothing west of 13th has retaining walls like that all the way down. So these must be some of those earlier homes that are now gone. And then the picture on the right is a picture of car 44, which was the West End extension that ran from 13th Street to 17th Street. It was about a mile long, and it ran from 1890 to 1948. And this is one of the later years. It's one of the last years that trolley extension, or the trolleys period, in Roanoke were running. So some interesting things about these pictures. First, the Black men excavating. They could certainly work over in this neighborhood, either as laborers like this or as servants who lived in the house, but they were not allowed to rent or own property here. And I will talk more about that in a little bit. And that last bottom picture with that beautiful brick paved road is really telling about the desirability of living on Patterson Avenue, because if we go over to Old Southwest about the same time, the streets were a wreck. So this is Marshall and Day and Sixth. These areas were gorgeous. These are some of George C. Davis's photos, and his beloved Buick that is a model in so many of his pictures. He loved to highlight the horrible shapes of the roads. You have sidewalks in some instances, then they just disappear. And even if you do have a sidewalk, you're likely to be sprayed with mud or covered with dust and dirt from horse and carriage or car or even bicycles going by. So Old Southwest in the teens and the 20s wasn't a great place for being outside, for strolling around. However, Patterson Avenue was. It was this beautiful road that had wide sidewalks, and it was shaded by trees, and people would come over and stroll on these sidewalks and admire these beautiful houses that belonged to bankers and railroad tycoons and wealthy merchants and industry giants of the time. The postcard in the middle is painted from one of George Davis's photographs, and it makes you almost don't notice the houses because the focus is on that wide street and the bright gleaming sidewalks and how wide they are. And then if you look at the photos of Marcellus and Katherine Johnson strolling along, if you notice the edges of the sidewalks, they have a finished edge. It's like they have a hem on them. It's not like the sidewalks weren't wide enough to begin with, but you actually had to spread them out a little bit more to make it just a little more luxurious. And those are still there. Kat, they're in front of your house if you have never noticed. But those little extra bits are still on the sidewalks. And Patterson continued to be a lovely place to go walking and strolling long after its houses were vacated by Roanoke's elite. So when the second generation is here, it's still a beautiful and desirable place to come and walk because it was so wide and so walkable, period, compared to Old Southwest. Now, the heyday of building was around 1900 to the early 19-teens, and Patterson Avenue developed from east to west. So every couple years or so, you'll see houses creeping farther and farther west, but there was a definite pattern to where people were buying the lots and building. But what allowed the wealthiest residents to purchase their new grand homes is also what drove them away, and that's industry. So money as a byproduct of industry was great, but the pollution that came with it was a real bummer. So this beautiful neighborhood, if you look at this map around the edges, it was bounded on two sides by the railroad. You had at least two foundries or furnaces over here, a sheet rolling mill, and right over here down by the river was the West End Brick Company. So in short, it was dirty, it was loud, and it stank. That was exactly what they were trying to get away from. So by 1920, most of the big names in that first generation of residents left for new and fashionable and clean developments south of the river in Raleigh Court, Wasena, and Crystal Springs, which are just a dream when in 1891, when this map was produced. Now, some people say that the exodus of this first generation of residents signaled the beginning of the end for Patterson. But I think that the second generation that started moving in around 1920 is the most interesting because we start to see a fairly diverse group of people occupying what was one of the most exclusive streets in Roanoke. And most of the people in that second generation stayed for a long time. That's not to say that it was a totally inclusive neighborhood, though. From 1911 to 1917, two separate ordinances prohibited anyone from selling or renting property in white neighborhoods to people of different colors or ethnic backgrounds. If you were Black, you could work here, you could live here as a servant, but you couldn't rent or own a home here. Those ordinances were really slippery, though, because it seems that certain groups of people were exempt because they were white passing and allowed to live in the West End, but not in other white neighborhoods. So on Patterson, Rohr, and Chapman, we see the establishment of some very wealthy and influential immigrant families living alongside longtime locals. And some of those families are themselves now longtime locals. They stayed. On Patterson, you have a variety of tradesmen and often widows living next door to merchants and bankers. So there really is a great variety of people over here. And you have a great variety of architecture as well. On Patterson, the north side of the street sits higher, and the more elaborate and the earlier houses were built there. They have a better view too. I want to mention that the houses on Patterson from 13th to 18th Street and a couple extras outside of that boundary are covered under the H2 historic overlay because those houses have architectural significance. So every house we look at tonight has that overlay extended to them. Any permanent changes or repairs to the exteriors of these houses requires the owners to obtain the proper permits and permission from the Architectural Review Board for historical accuracy. So just so you know, these houses are here with some protections afforded to them. So there's our history. Let's have a quick and dirty architecture lesson, and then we'll do our tour. The three main types of houses on Patterson that you're likely to see. We're going to go from left to right. The first is a Queen Anne, which is an older style of house, and it's one that you see very often in the old Southwest neighborhood. It's a 19th century favorite that almost always has a steep roof with cross gables or large dormers, windows up in the attic, if you will, an asymmetrical facade. So your door is not in the center. And there's often bits of house on one side, like a tower or a turret, and not on the other. So it's very asymmetrical. Usually you have an expansive porch with decorative wood trim or gingerbread. Some have turrets and towers, like I said, or multiple balconies or upper story porches. So they're very ornamental and decorative. Queen Anne's place an emphasis on vertical elements. They always look tall, like they're kind of reaching upwards toward the sky. And when people refer to Victorian houses, they're probably talking about a Queen Anne. It's the most common, particularly in Roanoke. Another really common style of house on Patterson and in Roanoke in general is the Georgian Revival. And this is kind of the polar opposite of a Queen Anne. This house style is all about symmetry and balance, with the front door in the center and equal number of windows on each side of the door and each side of the house. The front door is usually covered by a roof held up with columns, and you call that a portico. And sometimes there's a porch attached to that as well. Sometimes those columns reach all the way up to the roof, and the second story holds a huge balcony. We'll see a couple examples of that a little later. The attic level holds symmetrical dormers along the width of a pitched roof, and they usually mirror the number of windows beneath them. So if the second floor has 3 windows, there are 3 dormer windows up in the attic level. So it's all very balanced. It's very symmetrical. The windows themselves have multiple lights or panes in them. The most common distribution of those multiple lights is usually a 6/6. So if you look at the windows on the first and second floor, you'll see that they're double hung, and there are 6 little lights in the top half and 6 little lights in the lower half, or panes. So that's really common, that you see these multi-paned, multi-light windows repeated in a Georgian Revival house. The style is meant to appear wide and imposing, and the decorative elements are very restrained, and they favor classical architecture. So you have columns and arches and some very restrained ornament. That's not what this style is about, not like the Queen Anne, where you've got gingerbread and towers and everything. Now, the most common style of house on Patterson is the one on the right, the American four-square. This was a modern style of architecture when Mountain View and much of Roanoke was being developed. These were kit houses sold by companies like Sears and Aladdin, and they were brought in by rail in crates ready to build. What a perfect solution for a housing crunch in Roanoke. The style is uncomplicated and functional, and it draws on comfortable and elegant living spaces that were made popular by the arts and crafts movement and by the prairie style of Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, four squares are exactly that. They are square buildings, square homes with four main rooms downstairs and four upstairs as a rule of thumb. Larger four squares often have extra rooms or additions on the back. Their roofs are usually pyramidical with a single cluster of dormers on the front and on one side. Now, when I say clusters, if you look at the dormer up at the top of that drawing, you see how there's three windows under one roof up there? Now compare that to the dormers on the Georgian Revival, where you have a single window under each little roof of the dormer. That's what I mean by a cluster, and some of them are really elaborate. So you've got these nice clusters of dormers. There's usually one on the front and one side. Large covered porches are very common, and although they are simple in plan, they are inherently customizable, and some of them can be very ornate through the use of decorative columns, pediments, like I said, really elaborate dormers, and patterned tin roofs. And we'll see a couple examples of those in just a few minutes. During the teens and into the 20s, these homes were all the rage. They were modern, efficient, and quick to build. Grandin and Raleigh Court are full of these homes because those areas were developed later than the West End, which still has some of the earliest examples. Now on Patterson, four squares were used as filler houses for lots that hadn't sold by the 19-teens, particularly on the south side of the street. But we're going to start our tour of houses with one that isn't any of those styles. This is 1405 Patterson. This is a Second Empire style house. This is an older style. It was very popular in the 1880s and the 1890s in the US. It's influenced by French architecture, and you don't really see many of these types of houses in Roanoke. The distinctive steep tapered roof called a mansard roof is the biggest clue that what we're looking at is Second Empire style. So this house's origins are a little hazy, and this is one of the ones that is kind of a cautionary tale to not believe what Zillow or deed cards in the city GIS real estate registry tell you. When I led the walking tour last June, I had come across information stating that this house was actually built in the late 19th century for a political figure who lived in the house very briefly, like months before selling it. And this was a classic case of, you know, you wake up in the middle of the night with this great idea that's going to solve all your problems and you forget to write it down. Well, I walked out of the house to leave and lead the tour, and I lost the document on my computer where that information was. So I've been looking and looking and looking for it, and I know I didn't make it up. It's out there somewhere. At any rate, on the map I was showing you in 1891, if you look here, there's this house. It has the mansard roof, and over on the side, it has a little bay window that you can see peeking through the trees. When we go in person, you'll actually see it. And then behind that little window, you can see there's a little extra, it's an extra doorway back here, but that's also shown on this drawing of this house. And that's exactly where that house should be. So it seems that that house was there at least in 1891. At any rate, this house is earlier than it is claimed to be. According to the city records, it was built in 1915, but in 1898, there was a man named James Castle who lived in this house. He was the superintendent of the Radford Division of Norfolk Western. He was there for at least a couple years, and he sold it to Frederick Ansden in 1900. He was the head of the West End Furnace, and he lived there with his wife, daughter, and 2 servants, and apparently couldn't stand his pollution from his own factory in 1904. So he only made it for 4 years, and he sold it to John McIlhenny, who was the superintendent of terminals of Norfolk Western. And he lived there with his family, most of whom also worked for the railroad. And they lived there till 1912. Then they sold it to S.K. Bitterman and his wife, Sally, who was the treasurer of the Fruit Conserving Corporation. I love that imaginative name there. And he was also a saloon owner, which I suspect is where he made most of his money. So they were there and from 1912 to 1919. And here we come on the threshold of that second generation. The first generation is very transient. It's very migratory. People stay for a couple years and then they leave. But in 1919, Claude and Myrtle Brady bought the house, and Claude Brady was the president of the Huff Colliery, and that was a very huge colliery, and it was one of the major producers of coal in the area. And he was also the vice president of District Nash Motor Company, which was a regional seller of Nash automobiles, which was kind of prescient of him to say, hey, these cars are going to be the next big thing. So he was a very wealthy man, and they lived in the house until the 1940s. So they stayed there a long time. They didn't mind that their neighbors were engineers or mechanics or clerks who worked for the railroad or who worked downtown in offices. They really seemed to enjoy living in this really diverse neighborhood. Now, you'll see when we do the walking tour, this house has always had an extra wide lot, and now it has an extra lot where there used to be a house, and we'll see that when we do our tour. So this was a really grand residence, and it's one of the earliest ones on Patterson Avenue. Now, 1501 is a Queen Anne. I call this an eclectic or vernacular Queen Anne because it's got all of the makings of a regular Queen Anne, but there's some really strange things going on, like the crenellated stone chimney top that looks like it belongs in a fortress, all the weird patterning of stones. This is so good to see in person. All of this definition and delineation of different parts of the architecture with stone, weird little stained glass windows that really don't serve any function except they're just cool and ornamental. And it goes back forever. We'll take a look when we do the tour down the side of the house. So this was built in 1900 for James S. Browning and his wife, Ollie. And he owned a coal mine. He sold this house in 1921 to a man named Gibran Jabbour, who was one of the Jabbour brothers who were Syrian immigrants, and they owned a grocery called Jabbour Brothers, another really innovative name there. And he lived here with his wife, Salma. Now, the Jabbour name is very well represented in Roanoke history, as there are lots of branches of this family in Roanoke, and they were almost all very successful grocers. You have multiple branches of the Jabbours living on Patterson and on Rohrer. Now, in 1928, he sold the house to the Women's Civic Betterment Club, the Women's Civic Betterment Club. This was an amazing, established, progressive club of women who were disturbed by the unsanitary and derelict conditions in the city as it grew. So they were the ones who were responsible for hiring John Nolan, to come and study the city and devise a master plan to help it grow properly. When they turned, they also hired bacteriologists, 2 bacteriologists, to come and document the detriments of having open sewage in the streets. And you know that is not good for anybody's health. So they worked with John Nolan and these bacteriologists, and they had a huge report typed up. But when they turned in their report containing all of these findings, it was kind of like a pat on the head and, okay, ladies, thank you. And it was filed away for 15 years and not acted on. Member Sarah Pogue Caldwell Butler, who was in this club, was responsible for establishing the public library, and she fought the same obstinate, dismissive city hall to do so. They told her if she could raise this obscene amount of money, like $30,000 in a number of months, then they would help her build, and she did it. So she rose to that challenge and she met it, and the city public library was established. And she then worked with the Black teacher Lucy Addison to establish a library for Black residents because they had nothing, which became the Gainsborough branch of the Roanoke Public Library. So there was a lot of good work coming out of this house on Patterson. Next door, you have this house, which is another, I call it, it is a Georgian revival. All of the pieces and parts are there, but it also almost looks like it wants to be a Foursquare again. So it's a little bit of a vernacular style of house. It's a Georgian revival with a Roanoke flavor to it. Now, this was built in 1915 for a pharmacist named John Barnes and his wife Maggie and their daughters. In 1920, he sold it to Abraham Jabor, who's the brother of Jabral, who lived next door. And he lived here with his widow mother, Hazel, in 1920 to 1931. In 1931, it was sold to the Malouf family, who were also Syrian immigrants and grocers, and the Malouf family are still here today in Roanoke. So these people came and they put down roots and they stayed. And this was the only white, so-called white neighborhood where Levantine residents were allowed to live. So Syria at this time was undergoing some border conflicts. The people today would probably identify as Lebanese, but their registries, the census lists the country of birth as Syrian. So you've got this establishment of the Syrian/Lebanese community that's huge today, starting to take hold as merchants and people to be respected in the second generation of residents of Patterson Avenue. So we'll move down a little to 1701. Now, this is a sneaky bit of architecture. This house was built around 1913, and it's basically a Foursquare from the roof down. And if you look at the plan of the house, you go in it, it's a Foursquare. It's laid out like a Foursquare. But the builder did a little sneaky borrowing from the Georgian revival to kind of camouflage that box shape. So it's got that simple pitched roof with the single dormers matching the number of windows on the second floor. And even the windows, the upper half of those double hung windows are meant to emulate the types of windows that you see in a true Georgian revival house. I love this house. When the former owner, the man who owned it before the current owners, bought this house. I think he paid $13,000 for it, and it was falling down. He basically rebuilt this house a piece at a time. And when he bought it, none of the original porch really was there. And so he was lucky enough to have a picture of it when all of the original pieces and parts were in place. And he had never seen a porch railing like that before. So he drove around looking all through the city. And when he couldn't find one in the city, he went out into the country. And I think he got into Franklin County before he saw a house that had a railing like that. And he walked up to the door and he asked the man, showed him the picture and said, "I'm rebuilding this porch. It has a railing like yours. Do you mind if I take some pictures close up so I can see what I need to do to build it?" So Steve Collins went out and took all these pictures and reconstructed that porch from nothing. It was like cedar shake. Oh, it was a mess. And reconstructed it as it was originally built in 1913. I love that story. It's so straight too. There's steel and concrete in this house. It's never going to fall down. Now, the first residents of this were William and Mattie Ranson, and he was an engineer with Norfolk Western. He lived here for 6 years till 1919, and he sold it to William Irvin, who was a machinist. Now, in 1922, Eli Witt, a local carriage maker, sold it to Ernest and Julia White, and Ernest was a car distributor with Norfolk and Western. So I'm kind of skipping over Ernest and Julia White. They surely knew all of their neighbors around because there's a lot of Norfolk Western people living on this end of Patterson at the time. But I'm most puzzled by how Eli Witt came into possession of this house because he never lived here. There's no records that show Eli Witt ever lived in this house. He lived down the street at 1420 for several years with his wife, Maggie. So I don't know if the owner, William Irvin, maybe owed him money or something, and he took the house as payment, but for whatever reason, he sold the house in 1922, having never lived here. And I bring him up because he's one of those people that it's very rare that we have any kind of photographic evidence that one of the residents of these houses existed. And I jump on it every chance I get. So his street was on, or his factory was on Kirk Street. And it's hard to imagine a carriage factory down on Kirk Street. But there is his factory in the upper right. Excuse me, 1 minute. A receipt from 1907 for a whopping $1.25, and something got sharpened, and something was 38 something, and I cannot read his writing, but we actually have his signature there. And then I can't say for certain whether that's Eli Witt in the bottom right, but that is what one of your carriage companies would have looked like in their showroom. So you could get all kinds of fancy collars for your horse, a new wheel, new fringe with your carriage cover. So that's what Eli Witt's shop would have looked like. And there's a picture of it right there. So he didn't live in 1701, but he somehow owned it and sold it in 1922. And this is right next door. This is Robert and Laura's house. And this was built in 1919. This is a four-square, an American four-square. And it's a really nice one because it has beautiful columns and transepts. And it's up, you can see this house and then also the previous house. See how they're up on a hill? These are on the north side of the street, so they get a better view than those of us peasants down on the south side who sit level with the street. So this is a really nice four-square with this beautiful wraparound porch and the columns. and those beautiful crepe myrtles that bloom in May. I took that this year because they both just went crazy at the same time. And that gorgeous retaining wall that has since been painted. It's just a beautiful house. Now, this was owned by Charles and Irene Thornton in 1919. And Charles Thornton was a real estate developer, and they only hung around for a few years. They sold it in 1924 to Louis and Lena or Irene Bacchus. And they were Greek immigrants. And Louis Bacchus owned the very lucrative Sunshine Shoe Shine Company that did tremendous business downtown because the streets were gross and people wanted their shoes to look nice when they were doing business. So his company was very busy all the time. And they stayed put here until 1940. And again, the early residents are very transient. They come for 5 or 6 years and then they sell. And then that second generation comes in the 20s, stay for a long time, and they contribute to the feeling of a real and tightly knit neighborhood. You had a chance to know your neighbors. You had a chance, to watch their children grow up. And sometimes, sadly, you get a chance, to see a spouse die and you get old together. And I think that's really amazing because you don't see that so much anymore. People move around so much. So I find that second generation just really, really amazing. And then across the street from us, that Foursquare is another Foursquare. Well, let me just show you, look how pretty that Foursquare is. And then you've got this one that's very plain. I call this the American Boar Square. And I can do that because this is my house, or our house, and it's really plain. I say that it is the most boring Foursquare in Roanoke. It's pretty dull as a house, so we've tried to make the landscape nice to kind of draw away from that. And this was owned by Robert and Ethel Buchanan in 1920. They were the first owners in 1920, and he was an engineer, and they lived here from 1920. He died in 1957, so he lived in this house 37 years. Once their elder daughter, Blanche, left home, they took in boarders to fill in a couple of the empty rooms. And these are mostly young colleagues of Robert's who are just starting out with their own families. And I know from censuses that they charge $20 a month to live in this house with them. Now, Ethel lived in the house for 2 years after Robert died, and she sold it in 1959, but I am fairly convinced that she is still here occasionally poking at me about the amount of dog and cat hair on her beautiful wooden floors. So, Anne, you weren't too far off about the seance. It's Ethel Buchanan is here with me tonight. So down the street, on the corner, we have 1729 Patterson, and this was built in 1916 for John McNellis, who was an Irish immigrant, and he was on the board of directors and a banker with the Colonial National Bank. He died in 1931, but he had sold this house to his wife and his sister in 1927, leaving his brother out of the deal. And if that sounds like an inheritance nightmare in the making, you are correct, because there were long legal battles over his estate, including this house and its furnishings. So it was a real sticky situation, and it got held up in court for a long time until they could figure out how to divide things. Nevertheless, the house stayed in the family until 1973. Now, besides my own house, this house is the one that really made me start looking at the residents, the people who lived in this house. I was absolutely obsessed with Najib and Susie Jabbour, who lived in 1801 Patterson. And of all things, ironically, this is the house I can find almost no information about before the year 1922, when Najib and Susie Jabbour bought it. Supposedly it was built in 1905, but I can't find any records of it in any censuses. In 1905, there weren't even any houses on the 1700 block. And this is accounting for the way everyone's addresses shift over time as the neighborhood is development. It just doesn't exist before 1922. And yet it seems like it's a much older house. So this one, I just keep working on trying to take it all the way back to the beginning. So Najib and Susie Jabbour immigrated from Syria in 1889, and they bought this house in 1922. This house was their third house that they bought since they came to Roanoke. They used to live, I think, on Kimball and then on Gilmer, and then they moved over here and bought this house. Najib was a hugely successful grocer, and there were also Jabbours kind of behind this house in the 1900 block of Rohrer Road too. Their daughters, Rose and Anna, were sales ladies at his store. And one of the girls married a boy from the Alouf family. We've seen the Malouf family. There was also the Alouf family, and they lived down the street in the 1600 block. And they're another Syrian family who are still very active today in Roanoke. Now, Najib and Susie lived in this house from 1922 until 1941 when they moved to New York City. And this picture on the left, I'm so tickled to have found this picture. And at one point I had pictures of the whole family inside the house. And of course I can't find them now. It's so frustrating. But here is Susie in her nice flowy dress on her wicker settee up on her balcony. And if you look over her shoulder, you can see that distinctive gambrel roof and the dormers of 1806 Patterson across the street. So that house is still there. I was so excited to find this picture, as I know exactly where she's sitting. She's sitting up on her little balcony, enjoying the beautiful day with 1806 in the background. Let me take a drink of water, just a moment. I'll be right back. I've also lost my place in my script because I set my phone down, which was a mistake. Okay. So I can tell the stories of this neighborhood and these people because the houses that I've shown you so far have been fairly well taken care of or completely renovated altogether. And we'll see some of those when we do the walking tour. The material record of these people's lives are still with us in the form of these houses. And that helps to preserve the memories and the narratives of the people who live in them, right? Out of sight, out of mind. But if you have the house there, you know, you can think about who lived in them, and it helps to keep these people's stories alive. But many of the properties within Patterson's H2 designation, with equally compelling and interesting stories, have been willfully neglected to the point where they're almost at the point of no return, because absentee owners are repeatedly cited by the city, but they don't do any kind of maintenance on the houses. And this neglect certainly isn't limited to Patterson Avenue. And I'm referring to the recent casualty of that resulted in the demolition of Henrietta Lacks childhood home that was in a different neighborhood without the protection of a historic designation. And that's really, really unfortunate. They really ought to look into the history of the houses here because they are so rich. And I'm going to share a few of these with you. And there's some sad stories here just regarding the state of the architecture itself. This is built in 1910, according to the GIS, but the first occupants of record that I've been able to find are Joseph and Martha Murray with Joe Jr. and daughter Ollie, who lived here in 1917. They sold this house in 1919 to Vernon Lehman and his wife Hortense, and he owned the Lehman Shoe Company, and his brother worked for him at the Lehman Shoe Company, and he lived down at 9th and Patterson. There was also a lady law clerk with the last name of Custer, and Morgan and Eula Stevens lived here at the same time. They were, Morgan was an electrician. This was probably always a rental and was divided up between several people or families. Now, a man named E.P. Bowling sold it to a carpenter's widow named Annie Fringer in 1924, and she lived here. There's that second generation again. She lived here until her death in 1940, keeping the house and renting rooms. The house is now empty and derelict, and the porch that you see in the side is in danger of collapsing onto the sidewalk. It's been empty and neglected for years, despite numerous citations from the city. They did actually force the owner to put a new roof on it a couple years ago, but that's the only thing that's been done. And one of these days, I'm going to come around the corner and that porch is going to be on the sidewalk. And it's really sad because it's a very interesting home and it's huge. It's almost 4,000 square feet. It's really large. This is 1702. These are our neighbors on the corner. This was built in 1917 for Robert and Carrie Koger. And Robert Koger was the secretary treasurer of the Anthracite Coal Company and the secretary of the Free Service Pharmacy. And they were only here for 4 or 5 years, and they sold it in 1923 to Howard and Lula Baker. And Howard was a machinist at Norfolk Western. And they lived in that house with their daughters into the 1950s. And I always hope that they and the Buchanans who owned our house got along well, because that's a long time to live next door to somebody. Until 2012, it had only ever been owned by the Baker family. It was sold at auction in 2012 for $16,000, and it's been sitting empty and neglected since. Since this is next door to our house, and if it looks bad, our house looks bad, we keep the yard mowed, and Mike goes out and trims the brush, and we pick up the pieces of soffit and slate that continually fall from the roof. The owner comes by a couple times a year to mow, but we've already done it. And I can't remember the last time he went inside the house, which actually has its original light fixtures in it. And catty corner from that house is this one that's just breaking my heart, and it's so cool. This is built around 1907, and the first resident is this man with his marvelous mustache in the corner. That's Wiley Winton Smith, and he was a noted, very famous Appalachian evangelist and author who traveled around and did tent revivals all throughout Appalachia. And he wrote his most famous book of sermons, To Get to Heaven, when he lived in this house. He was only there for a couple years, and he sold it in 1909 or 1910 to Charles Stutzman, who was the secretary and treasurer of the Roanoke Carriage the Virginia Carriage Factory, and then the Stutzman Carriage Factory. So he moved up in the world. And then in 1920, the house was purchased by George and Carrie Stanley. And George was a conductor. And again, he would have known all of his neighbors since they all held similar status jobs at Norfolk and Western. And they lived there. Sometimes their daughter and her husband and son lived with them until the 1940s. It caught fire in 2015, and the owner started to redo the inside of it, but the insurance wouldn't cover it. So he just left it there and put it up for sale. And then it sold a couple of years ago, and we were so excited that somebody was finally going to save this house. And the person bought it and has never done anything to it. And that window you see on the right side of the porch has started dropping bricks onto the roof of the porch, which is starting to collapse. And I fear that this house is not long to be standing. So nothing is done. It's just been left to fall apart, despite literal inches of citations that have been issued and left on the front door, because I go up and look and see, because I'm nosy like that. And this house, I love this house. It's very plain, but it was a family house. The Thomas and Clara Kirkbride lived, this is an early Foursquare, around 1905. And they lived here with their kids, Louis, Mary, and Paul. So Dad, Thomas, and sons, Louis and Paul, all worked for the railroad. And Mary was a stenographer downtown, and Clara stayed at home and ran the house, as most wives were supposed to do who lived on Patterson Avenue. These people were working class, but they weren't that kind of working class. It was very unusual for the woman of the house to work outside the home on Patterson Avenue. So she holds this very traditional job, while people with grown daughters who weren't married were the ones who went out and worked. This house has been sitting gutted and empty for years, at least since we moved here. Sometimes a dumpster shows up in front, but no work really ever seems to happen. And then next door in that empty lot that you see, that was between 1922 and 1933, was owned by R.B. Gunn and his wife, Rebecca, the treasurer of Mountain Trust Bank. In 1933, the Gunns sold the house to attorney Paul Johnson. He lived there with his family and with his parents, Marcellus and Catherine Johnson, who we already met strolling down the sidewalk. And I can't tell you what the house looked like because it burned, like so many others in the neighborhood, in just another old house. And then that part of Patterson's history is gone forever. And the memories of the people in there then fade as well. And I didn't intend to end this talk on such a somber note, but I wanted to show you all what's going to happen to these last few homes eventually, because they are in such bad shape. I see them every day because I live by them, and I love to walk by and look at them and think about the lives of the people who lived in them. And I wonder about their furniture and their draperies, and is the original bathtub still in there, and can I have it? And I'm sharing them with you now because they aren't going to be here much longer. Despite that historic designation, this may be the only chance some of you, especially those of you who don't live here, have a chance to see them. When historic homes are abandoned like this, they've lost their lives. There's no life left in these, and we are watching them die. And like their inhabited neighbors, they deserve to be admired and not forgotten when they're ghosts in our collective memories. So we did kind of end on a seance note. So if you have questions, let me unshare and take a drink of water. And we can have a Q&A if you like. Is anybody awake? Still?
That was amazing, Holly.
Sure.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Holly,
Yes.
that was absolutely incredible. I love that presentation.
Thank you.
Are you willing to share that recording?
I'm not recording it.
Oh.
Anne is recording it. I don't know if
Oh,
that
I
can
saw
be-
there was
I
being
don't mind.
It can be available. Anybody who needs it, who wants to see it, we can share the link to the recording for sure.
Oh, cool.
Oh, thank you so much. We would definitely be interested in the link. This,
Cool.
that was incredible. So thank you.
I hope you can come on the walking tour. And if not, I can do a separate one for you guys.
Okay.
And yeah, that would be great.
That'll be in April.
Yeah, I think that's what we're planning. As long as it doesn't snow some more. Good grief.
Holly, I've got a question. I presume that Chapman probably got built after, I mean, houses started filling in on Chapman after Patterson. Is that?
No,
you found
actually, you guys have a
research?
lot of earlier houses on
Really?
Chapman. Yeah, because Chapman and Rohrer were a lot less expensive to purchase than on Patterson. So you have a lot of people on Chapman who worked, for example, at the Viscose company. So if you took the trolley and picked it up at 13th Street and took it all the way west, it would take you straight to American Viscose. So there are quite a few people in like turn of the century houses on Chapman who worked at the Viscose factory. So yeah, it was some of the better paid working class who lived up on Patterson after, you know, the bank presidents and such moved out. Actually, while our people were waiting for this house to be built, they actually lived in Mary Zompetti's house for a while. They rented rooms there. That was really, really weird. It's like, so it was like, once you got in the neighborhood, you kind of, and when we do the walking tour, there's some like musical chairs going on too. And eventually there's a couple instances where people moved down onto Chapman, I think because it's a quieter street. And I'll say that's one of the big drawbacks about living on Patterson is I like to know my neighbors, and it's really hard to holler across the street at somebody when it's that wide and they're up on a hill and there's cars and cars and cars and buses everywhere. So I think at certain points when cars became very popular, there are a couple people, I'll have to look at my notes, but they moved down onto Chapman. And actually my first choice when we moved here was a house on Chapman, because it seemed quieter and kind of more neighborhoody. So, hi, Tony. Wow. Tony's from one of my oldest friends. They're in South Carolina. So, but yeah, your house, I think I have, your house had a weird couple years where it kept getting sold like every 5 minutes. Yeah, we'll include that one in the walking tour.
Hey, Holly.
Yeah.
So I know that the historic designation starts at sort of halfway down 13th Street on Patterson. So, you know, so Patterson, you know, east, I guess, is not in the historic district.
That's right. That's right.
And was that area, say from 13th to 10th, like where Leap is and where there's some big houses that like restoration housing has redone closer to 10th? Was that residential and then those places burned, or was there more of a?
Yeah. Okay. So we all know Junius Fishburne, right? From Mountain View. Those of you who aren't locals, we have this enormous mansion called Mountain View. That was what was he? Was he mayor ever? He was some big wig, and
yeah, he published the Roanoke Times, and he also was involved in Norfolk and Western.
And yes, and tobacco somehow.
Yeah,
his
and
uncle, he was rich.
Yeah.
He was Daddy Warbucks rich, and built this huge mansion that's now kind of the community recreation center for the neighborhood. His uncle Tipton Tinley Fishburne lived at 10th and Patterson, which now there's like AF Fasteners or something. It's some ugly squat brick building. It's like this neo-Gothic Queen Anne Victorian mansion from 1888, and he lived there until 1920. And I think in the 20s and 30s, money was tight and the houses started to fall apart and you just let them go. Or you had knob and tube wiring and it caused fires. And most of those houses were wood down there. The early houses were wood. So they're gone. They either fell to deferred maintenance or neglect, or they caught on fire. So yeah, there's a couple later four squares down there, but those ones that were redone for, I think, low income housing, those are older, but those are some of the only older houses left in that stretch.
But it was residential, and then but something happened to the residences along Patterson.
Yeah. There was a grocery store in the empty lot that belongs to like it's like a fireman's union or something there, and then there's a big fenced in, and it was like the Roanoke Grocery Company, which is kind of ironic that it wasn't one of the Jabors. Like, really, open your store right there, you can walk to work. But that was the only non-polluting industry that was here, the commercial. We had a grocery store and that was about it. And other than that, everything was residential.
I had one other question. The narrow gauge railroad that kind of crosses over, Chapman and Patterson and Salem, going up to where the foundry was, which I gather is sort of behind where the Hurt Park Elementary is now. Do you see any like evidence of where it crossed or how along Patterson, or it's all?
Yeah, that's up by Bridge Street. Yeah, it would have wound around because Schaefer's Crossing wasn't there yet, all of those tracks. So it wound around the West End. So the West End kind of does this at the West End, and it kind of followed that and crosses over near Bridge Street. I've never actually looked for remnants of the track, but I'm sure they're there. Now I'm on a quest. As if I don't have enough to go sleuthing for. But yeah, no, that's you can see in that map that it kind of loops around and goes straight to those furnaces to dump that ore off. And I know he supplied almost all of let's see, it was the West End furnace and Crozier Iron. Those were two of the big iron smelters down here on the West End. And he supplied Crozier with almost all of their ore. So it just went directly around and to the furnaces there. Really handy, but dirty. Now I have to go looking for it.
Yeah, I know that Ferdinand Avenue, the way the houses are like don't face the street and it's narrow.
Yes.
That was originally the narrow gauge railroad was right there, which is why the houses don't face the street, because it wasn't just.
Wow.
So.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, but it kind of, once you hit Marla's block, it kind of loses you kind of lose the scent, because it kind of, I think it goes behind where the church at West End Presbyterian is now, and then it kind of goes off somewhere.
Oh, interesting. I'll look and see what I can find.
Yeah, I've just been really curious about it.
Oh,
so which is why it's just such a funky, angle and such a funky, like,
one of the things I'm looking for too is I want to go down and find where the West End Brick Company was, because it should be like on Cleveland, directly behind our house, if that map is right, or close to it. So yeah, no, I need to go out with a digging stick. and a measuring wheel and try to find evidence of brick making and railroad tracks. But no, that's fascinating. I'll go and poke around and see. It's really tough because so many layers of asphalt have been put down that it's difficult. I'm still stunned that there's probably bricks underneath ours here. Thanks. Bye, Lisa. But I think it's 8 inches to a foot every century. Your street level tends to rise if you just don't grade, which is why when you go into places like Rome, that you lose a good chunk of the bottom of the building if it's not been excavated around. So yeah, about a century worth of asphalt and blacktop on top of those. If you don't tell on me, I'll go out with a pickaxe and like start looking for railroad track. No, it's a pothole. It was here already, I swear.
Do we still have brick under the pavement? I was asking.
Is there still brick under the pavement here on Patterson? I don't know. I would assume so.
You've seen that? Yeah.
You want I should go out with my pickaxe and hit it, give it a whack? Oh, I know what I was, the picture of the subway car. Hang on, I have to go back because not everybody knows this, and it's one of my favorite things about that picture. The picture of the trolley on the extension is, and that already looks like it's paved. There it is. I mean, that already looks like it's paved and you can't see the brick, I don't think. That's our house underneath the green arrow. I was so thrilled when I saw that picture. I was like, oh, that's our house. It's like the only picture that exists of the American Boer Square, and it's right there. But it looks like it's already paved right there. This is from a book that you get at the O. Winston Link Museum downtown, The Street Railways of Roanoke. It's a really, really interesting book, and I'll have a look in that and see if I can find any information about the narrow gauge railroad. I just love that he brought it back to the hotel and he would like take his guests on rides, like it's some little kiddie ride or something for you, take you up to the iron mines, and you can still, we walk the dogs up there and you can still find chunks of ore lying around in certain parts where the mines were.
Holly, I had a question. I noticed that a lot of this generation that you're describing left in the 40s.
Yeah.
Or maybe they died, I don't know.
Yeah.
But also that the streetcar ended in the 40s.
Yes.
And I'm curious, what was that time period like in this neighborhood? What shifts were happening?
Well, one of the things, and we'll see this on the walking tour too, the streetcars were put out of business by jitney buses, and people who drove jitney buses were jitneurs, and there's a jitner on Chapman, and we'll look at their house when we're there. So I was talking to my husband tonight about why they stayed so long. And it's like, well, you get into a place, the 1920s kind of slowed down economically in the middle, and then it crashed. And if you're in a house like one of these, you're gonna leave? No, you're gonna take in boarders and make some money and give people a place to live. And I think recovery in the 30s was slow and people got comfortable living in their homes. You have a border and it was just easier to stay put, I think. It's late. Oh, Mike's saying that the alley is brick. I don't know how I don't know this, but I believe him. He lives here. 1940s, and you'll notice I said they lived here until the 1940s. So for some of them, I don't have exact dates because this is a work in progress. So some of them died, some of them, I don't know exactly how long they stayed or what happened to them. That's something I'll look into, but I'm fickle. And once they're gone, it's like, okay, bye. I don't care. I'm not interested anymore because this is where we're focusing. But yeah, that's a really good question because it's almost like, oh, we're free and we can move on. I don't know why the Jabors left. I guess their kids were raised and, you know, they'd had enough. And they're the Najib and Susie Jabor. They're really interesting because they came and they bought their house. You can see in the censuses if they bought with a mortgage or if they owned it outright. And they owned every house they bought outright. And they kind of worked their way up. And I think that's really interesting. And then they came, I really, really want them to have made that, had that house built for them, because it's kind of like the crowning jewel of their progress and their success in Roanoke. But yeah, they went to Queens and like retired in Queens. And why not? You know, hey, we worked, we raised our kids, we lived in this awesome, huge house, and we're going to New York to retire. So I did actually kind of look up to see what happened to them. But they have a really active family group on the genealogy website. So there's still a lot of Jabors in the country. It's really interesting. Yeah. So I don't know. That's the long answer to your question. I'm not sure why the 40s was an encouragement to leave. It could be too that the people were older and these houses are a lot of work. I don't ever want to live in a house with stairs ever again. It's such a pain. I hate going up and down them. I hate cleaning them. I love the house, but in another 10 years, I don't want to deal with it. And I'm sure, these people worked all the time. You don't want to come home and have to clean a big house. So that could, in the 40s, small, compact Lego houses. Yeah. That's a good question. Who else?
Any other questions, guys? We're gonna do the going once, going twice.
Holly, good night and thank you. It was really a wonderful talk.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm glad. I was so afraid that you would all be just bored out of your
Not at all.
skulls. No, Tony's not. Hi, Tony. I haven't seen you in years. When are you coming to visit?
Probably in the spring.
Okay.
I got
Tony
plenty
just
of time on my
retired
hands.
from-
I got plenty of
Yes.
time on my hands now.
I know you do. Tony just retired from UPS, so you gotta come and visit. Now you know what to expect.
Yeah, actually, I'm looking forward to it. I actually want to see
I'll
some.
give you a little ride up the mountain and you can see the iron mines. Come back and I'll make you dinner. So yeah, it's good. I'm glad you found it interesting, all of you. So you're welcome, Shane. Thank you for coming. Hi, Jen.
Guys, one question as we wrap up. So does anyone have strong feelings about whether to meet in person or online again? So Christina Nifong, who's still on the call here, is going to be presenting from LEAP. There's lots of good grocery energy in Holly's talk, and they're going to be maybe starting a grocery store here.
Hey, God, we need a grocery
Hopefully
store
they can get
here.
some- Yeah. Christina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll give you a minute if you want to say hello to us and give us a little 20-second preview.
Hi, sure. Well, yeah, LEAP just purchased 1027 Patterson, so on that closer to downtown side. And we are have big plans for what we hope to do there, putting in a food hub and a small sort of green grocer type space, and consolidating our offices and things. So Yeah, I will give a little bit of a presentation about what LEAP does and then what our plans are for the property there. Or if there's anything people in particular want to hear, I can accommodate that as well.
I think conversation so far has tended towards maybe meeting in person in March. I haven't heard any strong feelings, in favor of meeting virtually again for March. So we'll wait to see if any more feedback rolls in, but we may see. What we don't know is about PowerPoint presentation at Fishburne Mansion. So I don't know if the space at Freedom First has good presentation capability. That might be a possibility. Or we could just meet at 1027 and walk around if there's lights on there.
Yeah, it's, let's see, it is in really rough shape right now. One of my jobs is to go in and take photos of sort of every room. So we'll have a before and after, but there's like rubble, inside. And so probably within a month, we're not going to be able to meet there. We can maybe walk around the outside. And I think meeting at the community room at Freedom First is a possibility. And then if people did want to afterwards sort of walk over and see the outside, that might be possible. So I can definitely check into that if that's.
Yeah, that was going to be my suggestion, since it is closer to where you're going to be, and I think it's a little bit more of a modern setup. When we've tried to do audiovisual stuff at the Fishburne Mansion in the sort of like tea room or dining room, it's kind of echoey and it's hard to get. Someone did want to join virtually. That has only worked out minimally in that space. So yeah, if that's a possibility, I think that would be the best of all worlds.
Yeah, let me look into that. And it's March 8th. And
6:30.
Like, okay.
Yeah, and we could meet a little bit earlier if we wanted to, if we needed more daylight or something like that. We're flexible on that score. Anyone want to speak against this idea or for it before we?
I'm fine with that.
Okay. That's sort of been on my mind as the best of all worlds for this opportunity.
Yeah. And Holly, I would love to tap into your research if there's any, as we're talking and maybe walking around or whatever, but if you end up having any information about that area, it'd be great for us to.
I haven't gone down that far yet. It's coming, but it's like going down a rabbit hole. But I originally was just, I'm just going to do Patterson, and now I keep kind of spreading out into the surrounding streets as well. So yeah, that could be next. That one will be really tricky because of all of the empty lots and the kind of, everything there is a concrete block building and empty lots now, with a couple exceptions. So we can try and reconstruct, what was there. That would be really interesting. Kind of sad. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the building itself, I guess, I'm not sure. It definitely had some commercial use at some point. I'm trying to remember. Somebody, I think, said it was a showroom for something, which kind of makes sense with those big,
those arched windows. Yeah.
And it's definitely a huge cavernous space. We're going to put our food hub in the back, and it's a huge open space. So it makes sense that would have been a showroom.
Something for a show. Okay, wow.
Yeah.
So is that the original building you think that was there?
I'm not sure.
I'll look into that.
Yeah,
challenge.
1027.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll look into that. What's really handy, I need to get the old maps and have a look and see how those were. I mean, it's not going to be quick. It takes forever to kind of sift down. I need a name or a street number or something, and they shift over time. But then once you find that, it's like finding the end of the string and you just keep pulling. So I'll keep it in mind and do some sleuthing and see what I can find. It says after I find the railroad and the brick factory. He's kind of hiding in the back there.
We can put them ahead of us in line. It's okay.
Yeah.
That's just an idle curiosity.
Well, that sounds great. I look forward to seeing everyone next month.
Yeah, I have one more quick question for Holly about a neighborhood question.
Yes.
What is your knowledge about the orange kitty cat in the neighborhood?
He needs a home.
Yeah.
Chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this the one without the tail?
Look at Tony laughing because it's a cat question. Thank you.
No,
Shut up.
he has a tail. Yeah, he has a tail, and
Yeah,
he's really
You're so
friendly.
gonna- You're
His
so
name
gonna
is-
adopt it.
His we call him, everybody calls him Chet. And did you see me out in the street flipping people off yesterday who were speeding as he was trying to cross the street? And I thought he was going to get hit. But he's super sweet. He's really friendly, and he desperately needs a home because he's going to get hit.
We named him Travis.
Adopt him, please. He's such a sweet kitty.
Well, you have room for another cat, right?
Me?
Yeah.
No. We have 4. We have plenty, and 2 hounds. So no. You have like 2 cats.
Yeah.
Please, in that giant house. No. Tony, that look on your face. No. Are you down to 3? Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Chet or Travis, he needs a home.
Yeah.
Orange kitty. I don't want to go out and find him in the
Well,
road.
there's a gray
He's
tabby.
kids.
Yeah, there's a gray tabby, female tabby, that's stray as well around.
Oh, there's tons of them.
Yeah.
You'll learn. Yeah.
I think the tailless one, the orange ones down here are different than your orange ones. So we have a pair, and one lost his tail, and his tail was like sitting on the sidewalk for months.
Oh
Oh my
God.
God.
It was really bad.
Did you keep it?
No, I think it's
Hang it
finally
from your rear view mirror.
It took us a long time to decide to pick it up because it was gross. So
Oh man.
yeah, that's another story. So anyway, guys, we are gonna wrap it up. It's a little bit after 8. Thank you all so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Holly, I owe you a glass of wine.
Yeah, we'll do that.
And yeah, absolutely. All right. Goodbye, guys.
Bye. Tony, I'll send you a link. Bye. Thank you.
Oh, and we will send out to the link to the recording.
Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Laura, can you end it?